for most of you who have been taking the rightly dividing the word course, you understand that when it begins, or a chapter begins, or a statement begins, says after these things, you have to refer to the events that happened before. In this instant, we don't have to, because he's just talking about when Abraham rescued Lot and he met Melchizedek and gave him tithes. And so basically saying, so after those events, the word of the Lord came unto Abram in a vision and says, "Fear not, Abram, I am thy shield and thy exceeding great reward." And Abram said, "Lord, what wilt thou give me, seeing I go childless? And the steward of my house is this Eliezer of Damascus." And Abraham said, "Behold, to me thou hast given no seed, and lo, one born in my house is my heir. And behold, the word of the Lord came unto him, saying, This shall not be thine heir. But he that shall come forth out of thine own bowels shall be thine heir." And he brought him forth abroad and said, "Look now toward heaven and tell the stars if thou be able to number them." And he said unto him, "So shall thy seed be." And he believed in the Lord, and he counted it to him for righteousness. So after God makes the promise to Abraham, some time goes by. Has God ever made a promise to you and it doesn't seem like the promise is coming to fruition? He makes a promise to you and then time slips away. And so you begin to question, I wonder if this promise will be fulfilled. And then you begin to devise your own plan about how you will fulfill the promise that God made to you, as if he's not able to perform it himself. So in this account, Abram doesn't see anything happening. God comes to him and says, "Fear not, Abram, I am your shield or your protector, and not just your reward, but I am your exceeding great reward." In other words, he's saying, I'm good for it. And then Abraham turns and says, "What shall you give me? If you're saying that you are my exceeding great reward, I don't have any children. I go childless. You promised me something, but I don't see it coming to pass." He says, "Let me help you out, God. There's a steward in my house. His name is Eliezer from Damascus. This shall be my heir. What you promised me, I don't see happening." Abram is beginning to settle for crumbs, because he doesn't see the fullness of the blessing of God. And so he comes up with his own resolution. This one born in my house, he shall be my heir. Now keep in mind, when you study, and I invite you to continue to come to the Rightly Dividing the Word classes, because then you begin to understand symbolic language and figurative language and types and shadows and different things. And so Eliezer was a steward in Abram's house, which means he was a servant. Now when you do the types and shadows, then you begin to understand, and you tie that in Ishmael and Hagar, which we will do in a few minutes. Ishmael, though born in the house, represented bondage. He represented servitude. He represented the works of the flesh, because that's what servitude and bondage represent. He was a servant. And so God says, "This shall not be your heir, but that which comes forth from your own loins or your own bowels shall be your heir." Because Abraham did not understand the magnitude of the promise of God, he was about to come up with his own resolution that didn't fit within the promise of God, because every seed produces after its own kind. And so you can't take something that represents servitude and bondage and create a people of liberty. You can't take something that represents the works of the flesh and use it to transform people to walk in the Spirit. Eliezer could not be used because he represented servitude. Abraham was about to settle for crumbs and take something that was not fit to use for the promise of God. So God says to him, in order for you to understand, let me tell you that your seed will come out of your own bowels or your own loins. Okay? And then it says, he believed God and it was counted or imputed to him for righteousness. So some more time goes by and nothing else happens again. You say, you are my shield and my exceeding great reward, but I don't see anything happening. How many of you, God has promised some things and it seems like it's a bit delayed? I admonish you, don't settle for the crumbs that fall from the table. Take your seat at the table. Be partakers of the full blessing. So after these things in Genesis chapter 16, so obviously Abram tells Sarah about the vision, that God says to me that my seed will come out of my own loins. I can't use Eliezer. I can't use the seed that represents something contrary to what God has promised. And see, what you have to understand is that when God sets a premise, that is carried throughout the ages. That's why he told Moses when he was building the tabernacle, build it according to the pattern I showed you in the mount. Because every single thing in the tabernacle pointed to the redemptive work of Jesus Christ. And so you have to have a holy seed. You have to have a holy beginning in order to produce holy offspring. So Sarah says, okay, in chapter 16, I don't see anything happening. I have a handmaid in my house whose name is Hagar. The Lord has shut up my womb and I can't have any children. And so because the promise of God now states that the son will come out of your own loins, let me help you out. So she grabs Hagar and gives her to Abraham for his wife. 16:1 says, now Sarah, Abraham's wife, bare him no children. And she had a handmaid, an Egyptian, whose name was Hagar. And Sarah said unto Abram, behold, now the Lord had restrained me from bearing. I pray thee, go into my maid. It may be that I may obtain children by her. And Abram hearkened unto the voice of Sarai at the time. And Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar, her maid, the Egyptian, after Abram dwelt in the land 10 years. So you see some years and some time had passed. 10 years from the promise to get thee out of this country and from thy kindred. And after 10 years, I don't see the manifestations of God's promise, so I got to come up with my own plan. 10 years is too long. Lord, I got to intervene. So Sarah takes Hagar and gives her to Abraham to bear a son. And she bears a son, Ishmael. So then now in Genesis chapter 17, the Lord changes Abram's name to Abraham. So he changes his name to Abraham. And not only does he change his name, but he enters into a covenant with him. And so the promise advances from just a promise to a covenant. And so, in other words, what the Lord is saying now is that this isn't just a mere promise I am making to you. But this now becomes a covenant. Which brings us to, when we did rightly dividing the word, it's called the Abrahamic covenant. And for those of you who studied with us in rightly dividing the word, you know that the Abrahamic covenant is an unconditional covenant. An unconditional covenant simply says that no matter what you do, there's nothing you can do to break the terms of the covenant. What a promise. God made a promise, or he entered into a covenant with Abraham and says that no matter what you do, I will perform this. Abraham was not capable of breaking the covenant. Go with me to Hebrews chapter 6, verse 13. The fulfillment of the promise of the covenant is not based on your actions, but it is based on the word or the oath and the promise that God made. And there's nothing you can do to make the promise void. Hebrews chapter 6, verse 13 says, "For when God made promise to Abraham, because he could swear by no greater, he swore by himself, saying, surely blessing I will bless thee, and multiplying I will multiply thee. And so after he had patiently endured, he obtained the promise. For men verily swear by the greater," which is true. If you make an oath with someone, you swear by something that's greater than you. And an oath for confirmation to them is an end of all strife. Notice what it says in verse 17. "Wherein God willing more abundantly to show unto the heirs of promise the immutability of his counsel, confirmed it with an oath, that by two immutable or unchangeable things in which it is impossible for God to lie, we might have strong consolation who have fled for refuge to lay hold upon the hope set before us." And so the two immutable things there are his oath and his promise. And so he entered into a covenant with Abraham. And in further reassurance, he says, let me make myself clear. See, the first time, it wasn't that clear. He says, I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless them that bless you, and curse them that curse you. And I will make your name great, and in you shall all the nations be blessed. That's a general thing. Then after Abraham came up with his own device and said, this steward in my house shall be my heir. Then the Lord comes back and says, let me double down on what I'm saying. That which come forth of your own loins shall be your heir. So then they come up with another plan. Okay, we'll use Ishmael. So then the Lord comes back and gives them the full assurance that let me explain to you in no uncertain terms what the promise is. Genesis 17 and 16. Let's back up to verse 15. And God said unto Abram, as for Sarah thy wife, thou shalt not call her name Sarai, but Sarah shall her name be. And I will bless her and give thee a son also of her. So now it's clear. The son that you will have will be born of Sarah. See, because at the time they did not understand the premise that God was setting. And sometimes in your life when God promised you something and the promise is delayed, you do not understand the full impact that that promise will have on generations to come. I will bless her, and she shall be the mother of nations, and kings of people shall be of her. Then Abram fell on his face and laughed and said in his heart, shall a child be born unto him that is 100 years old? And shall Sarah that is 90 years old bear? Notice what verse 18 says. And Abraham said unto God, oh, that Ishmael may live before thee. In other words, he was pleading to God on Ishmael's behalf. But God says, And God said, Sarah thy wife shall bear thee a son indeed, and thou shalt call his name Isaac, and I will establish my covenant with him for an everlasting covenant, and with his seed after him. From the time the promise is made, there will be distractions and obstacles. From the time God makes a promise to you, there will be distractions until the fulfillment of the promise. And if you give in to those obstacles, it is the equivalent of settling for crumbs. It's time to take your seat at the table. See, because when God promised to Abraham that he would make of him a great nation and that in him all nations shall be blessed, he had the entire world in mind. This wasn't just about giving Abraham offspring. The promise was greater than just Abraham having children. So after Ishmael was born, they thought that that was the solution to the promise. But Ishmael also represented the works of the flesh. In God's eyes, Ishmael and Eliezer figuratively represented the same thing. So when Abraham said, "Oh, that Ishmael may live before you, please use Ishmael," Abraham did not understand the plan of God. Because Ishmael represented something. He represented the works of the flesh. Go with me, please, to Galatians chapter 4, verse 21. And I like it when the Bible interprets itself. And notice I'm using a lot of nuggets that we use in rightly dividing the word in our classes. So Galatians chapter 4, verse 21 says, "Tell me, you that desire to be under the law, do you not hear the law? For it is written that Abraham had two sons, one by a bondmaid and the other by a free woman. The bondmaid was Hagar. The free woman was Sarah, his wife. But he who was of the bondwoman was born according to the flesh. But he of the free woman was by promise, which things are an allegory. For these are the two covenants. The one from now, what Abraham didn't understand was that each one of his sons they were representative figures. Let me read it, then I'll come back and recap. Which things are an allegory, for these are the two covenants, the one from Mount Sinai, which genders to bondage, which is Hagar. For this Hagar is Mount Sinai in Arabia, an answer to Jerusalem, which now is and is in bondage with her children. But the Jerusalem above is free, which is the mother of us all. For it is written, Rejoice, thou barren, that bearest not. Break forth and cry, thou that travailest not. For the desolate hath many more children than she which had a husband. Now we, brethren, as Isaac was, are the children of promise. Now notice what it says there. That the two sons of Abraham represented two things. Ishmael represented the flesh. Isaac represented the spirit. Not only did they represent the flesh and the spirit, but Ishmael represented the Old Testament or the Old Covenant. And you know that the Old Testament could not make you free. It could not bring deliverance. It kept you in servitude and in the works of the flesh. But Isaac represents the New Testament, that which sets you free, that which brings deliverance. And so when you compare the two things, Ishmael represents bondage. His mother Hagar was a bondservant or a bondmaid. She also represented Mount Sinai, from where the law came, which genders or produces bondage. Mount Sinai, which produces bondage, corresponds to the Jerusalem, which at the time was under the oppression of the Romans. And so the whole theme of slavery and bondage and servitude is consistent with the figurative use of Ishmael. Not only bondage, but works of the flesh. On the other hand, Isaac represents liberty. It represents the Jerusalem which is above, spiritual Jerusalem, which is free. It represents that which produces offspring of liberty. It represents a birth of promise. And also, he represented sonship. So when God made the promise to Abraham, he had the entire message of salvation contained in the promise. See, God will make some promises to you that are on a deeper understanding that you can appreciate at the time. And if you come up with your own idea of how you will resolve and solve the issue or the promise, you will miss out on the long-term benefit that God is willing to provide. So the magnitude of the promise or the fullness of the promise, Abraham did not understand. He was prepared to settle for less than the full blessing. It's time to take your seat at the table. The bread or the promises or the provision or the inheritance of God is on the table. The inheritance is before us. Some of us are at the table. Some of us are standing afar off and looking at the table. Some of us are sitting under the table and waiting for the crumbs that fall from the table. But when God makes a promise to you, you have to sit at the table. When you take your seat at the table, all provisions that the Father has available is made available to you. I was reading a book by Vince Lombardi. It's called The Lombardi Rules. Football. And in the book, I love football. And in the book, he says sometimes you need to ask yourself, what is my job while I am on earth? What is it that needs doing that if I don't do it, it won't get done? What is it that needs doing that won't happen unless I take personal responsibility for it? Will I live my life in accordance to the promise of God, or will I live my life at the crumb level? There's some things that God has put in you that if you don't bring it forth, it won't come forth. Or it won't come forth to the degree and based on the characteristics that you present as an individual that will be made manifest. Everyone has a call or a purpose in this life. But if you don't take your seat at the table, you'll settle for crumbs. See, like I said, when the Syrophoenician woman was outside the promise of God, settling for crumbs was all right. As a matter of fact, Jesus admired so great faith. But for those of us that are within the household of faith, settling for crumbs is not an option. Settling for crumbs is not a great show of faith. Those that are on the outside, that's fine with them. But once you come into the things of God, once you come into the fellowship of what He has provided, once He has set out the invitation and you've accepted it and you sit at the table, crumb days are over. It's time to partake of the full blessing that the Lord has provided. It's time to take the entire bread that He has given you. Stop settling for crumbs. Stop settling for the leftovers in this life. It's time to step up to what God has ordained for you to walk in. It's time for you to walk in your full potential. There are gifts in you that are waiting to be manifest. Paul told Timothy, stir up the gift that is within you. There's some things that are in you that are lying dormant that need some stirring up. And if you don't, you're settling for crumbs. So I admonish you, stop settling for crumbs. Know that God has called you. Know that His hand is upon you. And the thing that He has promised you, He will bring it to pass. Don't settle for the crumbs that fall from the table. It's time to walk in the full inheritance and blessings that God has provided for you to walk into. Hallelujah.